Miss M, it's been about 12 or so years now. I know you don't work there anymore, thankfully. I don't know what could possess an adult woman, 50 plus no less, to torment a child to the breaking point. Maybe you're just a miserable old lady who was a loser in school, and so you targeted other losers to bring yourself up. But how you treated me and evidently others was not only unprofessional, but very cruel and damaging. I was a good student before. Miss M had my family members in years prior. Unlike me, my cousins and siblings are rowdy and can be a handful. She had words with my family before, so when I came along, I was the symbol of my family of which she would take out her anger upon. I was meek and obedient, a perfect target. Miss M would humiliate me any chance she would get. She would bring me up in front of class, call me stupid, an idiot, ugly, pointed out that my legs weren't shaved, told me that I looked like a boy. Mind you, I had long hair and stuff. I just didn't wear makeup at that age. Talked to me very slowly if I asked any question. Talked to me like an actual dog. A bad girl, go fetch, bag, etc. Told me that I smelled bad. The list goes on and on. She would sometimes aggressively pat me on the head and shout, "Good girl," when I completed one of her dog commands. She would actively encourage other kids to make fun of me as well, and further isolated me from everyone. I started to fear any interaction with her. I feared my classmates as well. A boy in my class was being relentless and made me cry one day, so I retaliated and threw a pencil at him. I was berated heavily and treated even worse after that, so I learned to shut down and take it all. My grades slipped. I cried every day at home. I kept most of it to myself, which Miss M probably knew I would, which is why she went so hard at me. My parents did try to get my class switched, but the school refused. Not only did Miss M act like an angel around other adults, but the other classes were apparently packed to capacity, so I couldn't switch. But I also don't think my parents tried very hard. The teacher conferences made things worse each time. She'd be alright for a day or two, but the hammer would come down harder. I had to keep all of the torment inside to survive. She made fresh hot chocolates for the class the day before our Christmas break. When she gave me mine, I was scared and accidentally knocked it over on myself. I always was a clumsy kid. Instead of being concerned in the slightest because it was literally scalding hot, she let out a flurry of screams and threatened that I had better get it clean quickly and spotless, or she would make me sorry. I did as I was told, and ignored the searing pain in my foot. I was not allowed to call to get a change of clothes, and I was the only one not allowed to have more. The pain in my foot stabbed literally every second. It didn't let up all day, but I was so terrified. I said nothing and didn't shed a single tear, though it hurt like crazy. When I got home and pulled my sock off, my skin came off with it from the burn. My mother was livid and finally stood up for me. After Christmas break, Miss M was so overly sugary to me. "Why didn't you tell me about your foot, sweetie?" and was overly accommodating. It scared me. I thought it was a trap. But to my surprise, it lasted about 2 weeks. She must have had her butt handed to her. She wasn't as bad as before, but still sought to crush my spirit. On the last day of school, she refused to let me take any pictures of her. I wanted one to burn. She was very grouchy that day toward me, almost acting defeated, because although my grades were bad, I skimmed by and was moving to middle school. Her dog was off its leash and she was powerless to keep her toy. She was hoping that I would have failed. After 6th grade, I stopped caring about school. I failed a year, barely skirted by others, landed in a dropout prevention program in high school. I had few friends, and none of which I still have. I fought it hard to trust teachers or authority figures anymore. I never made scenes or anything. I just sat quietly and did nothing. Before, I actually tried, actually cared. And I had teachers that were disappointed in me because of how well I performed in math and on tests. I've never had test anxiety, and they wanted me in the mathletes one year, but I just didn't care, which I attribute, at least in part, to Miss M. She changed my life for the worse. The psychological damage that Miss M did to me cut deep. It's hard to convey in a brief post what it was like every day for that whole year. She tore down what confidence I had. She made me afraid to trust anyone. She made me believe that I was worthless. She made me feel every insult and criticism to the bone. She made me close into myself and learn to take abuse. She made me believe I was completely alone and had no one in my corner. The kids from my school that came with me reinforced it as well. They also believed that I was just dumb and they treated me as such. She dug her claws in deep and the scars still remain. I've tried to grow past it, but it's a hard thing to overcome. So do you, Miss M. You are not a teacher. You're a sociopath who used their power of authority to tear down a child. I hated you then, but as an adult, I just feel sad for you. I don't know what could possibly go through an adult's mind that would make them do that to a kid. Maybe you saw yourself in me and hated yourself, since we were both kind of outcasts. So you desperately tore me down and encouraged others so you could finally feel like you belonged, even if it was just a bunch of kids. Either way, I'm glad you were finally removed years later, and I hope that your stain in the world is soon wiped clean. I hope the others that you did this to live happy lives without having you as even a passing thought. We're not weak, and we do not deserve to be held as your victims. You did teach us that there are bad people out there. We may have struggled from it, but we pushed on. Hopefully none of us will ever meet you again. When I was a student teacher, I was 21 and working with mostly seniors in high school, many of which were 17 or 18. One day, the mentor teacher I was working with pulled me aside from teaching my class to inform me that other teachers had overheard some students telling each other what they wanted to do to me. While disturbing, many of my friends and colleagues insisted that it's a fact of being a younger teacher working with high schoolers. The next day, I had a few girls in my class approach me and inform me that 3 specific boys were no longer just talking about what they wanted to do, but they were describing what they were planning on doing to me in the coming weeks, after school in the parking lot. Far more details than I would like to share. I went to the administration immediately, and they handled it very quickly and professionally. I was very grateful for their support. I was never touched nor harmed by any of these students, thankfully. What scared the absolute crap out of me, however, is not even a week later, one of the boys was arrested and pulled out of school. I didn't find out immediately, but I eventually learned he was being held for the alleged assault of his younger sister. It makes me sick thinking about it still. I genuinely hope to never meet him again. It's terrifying to think what could have happened had I not had some wonderful staff and students looking out for me. This was quite a while ago, so bear with me. I was a sophomore in high school finishing up a band practice. It was the afternoon, maybe 7:30, and me and my friends are just talking for a bit. We always chatted a bit after practice to avoid the crowd of people in the band hall. Plus, it gave us a chance to unwind a bit. We see one of our friends, a freshman, talking to his dad and his younger sister. Now, none of us had ever spoken to his dad before, but we had heard things and knew that he was a bit, shall we say, off. So, that's why we didn't really question what happened next. My friend was chatting for quite a bit, and finally the dad calls us over. Now, the guy my friend is talking to looks remarkably like him. Same hair, same skin tone, very similar mannerisms. The guy is pretty greasy looking, and he seems visibly uncomfortable, and is obviously in a huge hurry to get out of there. He's shuffling about and will keep eye contact, and he seems to be eyeing us up and down in a strange way. But again, he's our friend's dad and we know he was a pretty strange guy, so we're not really thinking much about it. He talks about how he wants us, me and 3 of my friends, all trombonists, to play for him in a Cuban jazz ensemble that he's putting together. We're all pretty big into jazz at this time, and he mentions how we'll be getting paid for both practices and performances, and we're all very excited. He is very insistent on us leaving with him that moment to meet the rest of his bandmates, and me and my friend are all for it. And now, we haven't really been noticing the girl standing next to him this whole time. She's been very quiet the whole time, but she was very visibly uncomfortable with the entire situation. By now, our band director has noticed us by this point, and he walks on over. She was a very no BS, hard-ass kind of person. She comes and asks, "Who's this guy?" Of course, I think she's mad because we've been taking our time and putting our stuff away. So, I respond, "Oh, he's just our friend's dad. He..." And right then, my friend cuts me off and says, "What? He's not my dad." Now at this point, the man gets very irritated. Our director tells him that he needs to leave. And this is when I start noticing the little girl more. First of all, she looks nothing like this man. This is pure conjecture on my part, but her skin color, eye color, hair color, none of them match him. The man starts arguing with my director, saying how she can't talk to him like that. He seems like he's about to punch our director. By this point, he's attracted some attention, and our 2 other directors are here as well. The little girl is grabbing him by the shirt, trying to keep him back. She's not crying, but her voice seems like she's about to. She's pleading for him to stop and asks him to please just go home. Now, this is the first time that the girl spoke to me, so this is when I first get a good look at her. She's very thin, wearing a t-shirt and shorts, and is younger than us by maybe a couple of years. She has some pretty obvious bruises and, as mentioned above, looks nothing like her dad. Finally, it seems the man's given up. He's attracted quite a crowd and he shuffles off. He doesn't really run to his car, but he goes off as quickly as he can without actually running, tugging the little girl at his side. They call the cops, and the cops circled the area looking for him and his car, but there's no sign and we never see him again. After the incident, we spoke to our friend about it, and he mentioned how the little girl approached him first and tried to get him to get into the car before the man finally got off the car and started to talk to my friend himself. I'm not too sure what was going on that date. I don't know what would have happened to us had we gotten in the car with him as planned, but it definitely psyched me out for a bit, and I'd completely forgotten about the incident until I was browsing this subreddit and it came back to me. Finally, I would like to add that we've since met the friend in question's dad, and they look remarkably similar, which is a weird coincidence. This story happened when I started at a new school in the middle of 6th grade. I'm 19 now. This was technically my first middle school, and for many reasons I transferred out. This definitely didn't help. I had almost always had a foreign language class, so I thought it would be a pretty easy grade to end with. There was a lot of buzz surrounding the Spanish teacher, Mr. D, and when I first saw him and how he acted, I thought I could tell why. He was a pretty eccentric guy who, if you only heard his voice and weren't looking at his stern face, you would think that he was pretty jovial. He almost always pronounced our names wrong, and he had this gigantic windmill on wheels in the corner of his room. The windmill reminded me that I had actually heard about this teacher from an older boy called Jay in my Sunday school class. It's weird how things can change so much in a number of years. I remember telling him that I was going to his school. My mom and I had run away in the middle of my 6th grade year, and I would start my new school after Christmas break had ended. It was nice to know that I had at least a couple of people that I knew, so I asked if he could tell me about the school, or if he had any advice. Jay had told me that if I ever got Mr. D, to transfer out immediately. It sounded a little bit dramatic, but as we got more acquainted with Mr. D, so too did he get more acquainted with us. One thing that always made us all uncomfortable was how he would rub chapstick on his lips fairly aggressively for like a minute, which was definitely made worse when he would stand with one leg resting on something and his crotch leaning forward. Sure, it was pretty uncomfortable, but not the worst thing in the world, just a bit odd. Have you ever seen a woman with her boobs resting on a desk? Sometimes it's on purpose and sometimes it's an accident, really when you're short and sitting down. Mr. D started to do this, but with his you-know-what. He would stand close to a desk to look at their work, but his bulge would be laying on their desk. He wasn't desk height either, so he stretched a little to do it, but given how strange he already seemed to be, I brushed it off as him not being self-aware. I just felt bad for the first row. Flash forward, and all of his little idiosyncrasies seemed to be more prominent as the days marched on. I remember once he even answered his phone and carried the conversation on a bit before stepping out of class. I should note that he wasn't a great teacher. He wasn't even a good teacher. English obviously wasn't his first language, which was fine because he was there to teach Spanish. But unfortunately, he couldn't speak Spanish either. He would always use the school PC to pull up Spanish videos on YouTube for us, and he would mindlessly stare at his personal laptop. Like I said, a pretty easy class. I just feel bad for the other students who didn't already know certain things when tests came. We walked in one day, and on my desk, the chair in front of mine, and the desk in front of mine, there was a semi-straight line of off-white liquid. It was mainly on my desk and thinned out across the chair and desk in front. Mr. D came over, not quite fast enough as the kid behind me asked what it was. All he got was nothing, as he very quickly wiped it away with his hand and rubbed it on his pants. He couldn't say water because it wasn't clear. It really only looked like one thing, but there wasn't any way to definitively prove it was. I tucked my hands in my sleeves and did my best not to touch the desk. About a week after that, I came into my English class that I had at the end of the day to hear one of the girls having a pretty loud argument with our English teacher. I walked into the middle, but the girl, Megan, was extremely upset and asking why she couldn't go to the principal. Megan was a bit of a hothead, sure, but she was still a really nice girl. I couldn't see her dramatizing a situation this much. I later found out what had happened from my best friend at the time, who was in Mr. D's class when it went down. Their class was ahead of us, so their test was scheduled for that day. After papers were passed around, Mr. D went back to zoning out on his laptop until Megan needed to ask a question. She had had her hand up for ages and he never noticed, so she went over to where he was and freaked out on him. He was watching some inappropriate material with the sound off on the laptop that he always brought with him and gave all his attention to. So, when I came in, Megan was being reprimanded for being pretty verbal with Mr. D. Our teacher was basically telling her that she shouldn't have been upset with a teacher watching that in class, and that it's his laptop, as if that nullifies anything. Looking back, it explains so much of his shifty behavior, resting against the desk, the hardcore staring, the personal laptop all the time, and the definite stuff on our desk. It wasn't the first time that he had done it, and it wouldn't have been the last if he hadn't gotten suspended for the rest of the month. Mr. D disappeared and we had a sub finish out the rest of the year with us. I got the heck out of that school after everything that had happened there, but still kept in touch with a couple of friends who went. They told me that Mr. D was back, but for a while he was the gym teacher and co-soccer coach, and the next year he taught English. I really want to say that it surprises me that he was brought back, even without knowing anything about what he was teaching, but it doesn't. In hindsight, that school was atrocious. I have so many memories of bad stuff students and teachers alike did. Another teacher was only given a suspension for actively looking down girls' skirts and up girls' skirts when they bent over. It's just concerning to know that Mr. D probably still works there.